The biggest mistake someone can make is believing the truth goes to sleep after midnight. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I stood barefoot on my front porch just after sunrise, staring at a wall of fresh dirt that had not existed when I went to bed. The sharp smell of damp soil mixed with shredded cedar mulch drifted through the cool morning air, while the faint rumble of a diesel engine faded somewhere beyond the entrance to my neighborhood. For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if I was still half asleep. My concrete driveway had disappeared beneath what looked like several truckloads of soil, decorative stone, and landscaping material stacked nearly 4 feet high across the entrance. My pickup truck sat trapped inside my garage, completely blocked by the massive pile that stretched from one edge of my property line to the other. Tire tracks cut through the fresh earth, and bright orange survey flags fluttered gently in the morning breeze as though they had always belonged there. Then I noticed her. Melissa Harper stood across the street beside a neatly trimmed flower bed, dressed in a navy blazer that looked strangely formal for 7 o'clock in the morning. She folded her arms, smiled politely, and watched me take in the scene without saying a word. When our eyes finally met, she crossed the street at an unhurried pace, stopping just short of the edge of my lawn. "Good morning, Ethan," she said with a confidence that immediately made my stomach tighten. The association approved an overnight beautification project. We wanted the neighborhood entrance to have a more welcoming appearance. I looked from her to the mountain of dirt sealing off my driveway and back again. "My driveway is the neighborhood entrance now?" I asked as calmly as I could. She smiled again, almost as if she had rehearsed the conversation. "It is only temporary until the landscaping is completed." Temporary. That single word echoed in my head while I studied the heavy equipment marks pressed into the concrete near the curb. Whoever had done this had worked carefully. They had not scattered dirt randomly. They had deliberately built a barrier impossible to drive through without heavy machinery. My phone vibrated with a notification from my office reminding me about an 8 o'clock client meeting across town. I looked at the clock. Less than an hour remained before I was supposed to leave. Yet my truck might as well have been buried under a small hill. Melissa seemed almost pleased by the silence. She glanced toward the blocked driveway, then back at me with the expression of someone convinced the argument had already been won before it even started. What she could not possibly know was that my house had never spent a single night unguarded. Years earlier, after a string of vehicle thefts in nearby neighborhoods, I had built a security system that recorded every inch of my property 24 hours a day without interruption. Every camera synchronized its timestamp to the same secure server. Every motion event was backed up automatically to encrypted cloud storage before sunrise ever arrived. I had installed the system because I enjoyed designing smart home security, not because I expected to become the target of my own homeowners association. As Melissa turned and walked back toward the clubhouse parking lot, believing she had trapped me before breakfast, I slipped my phone back into my pocket, unlocked my front door, and headed straight for the small room where dozens of silent camera feeds had already been waiting for me all morning. I closed the door behind me, walked into the small room at the back of my house, and listened to the familiar hum of cooling fans inside the equipment cabinet. 6 monitors mounted across the wall displayed live camera feeds from every corner of my property. The front porch, the driveway, the garage, the side yard, the backyard, and the street all appeared exactly as they should, except for the enormous pile of dirt that had transformed my morning into something I never expected. None of this happened because I distrusted my neighbors. Years earlier, after several vehicle break-ins across nearby communities, I had decided to turn my professional experience into something practical for my own home. I had spent more than 15 years designing residential security systems, integrating cameras, motion sensors, cloud storage, and automated monitoring for families who simply wanted peace of mind. My own house eventually became my favorite project. Every camera recorded continuously instead of activating only when motion was detected. Every recording carried synchronized timestamps, pulled from the same secure network clock. Every video file uploaded automatically to encrypted cloud storage within seconds, making it impossible for a damaged recorder or stolen hard drive to erase the evidence. License plate recognition covered the street in front of my house, while overlapping camera angles eliminated blind spots around the driveway and garage. Friends often joked that my home could probably document a squirrel crossing the sidewalk from 3 different perspectives. I always laughed because they were not entirely wrong. I believed that good security was supposed to become invisible. You stop thinking about it because it quietly did its job every single day. Most mornings I never looked at the recordings because nothing unusual ever happened. Children rode bicycles past the house after school. Dog walkers greeted each other before sunset. Delivery trucks arrived on schedule. Garbage collection happened every Tuesday morning. The cameras simply archived another ordinary day before beginning another ordinary night. Standing in front of the monitors that morning, I realized the system had finally been asked to do something far more important than protecting packages left on my porch. It had become an impartial witness. Before reviewing anything, I opened my phone and sent a short message to my client explaining that an unexpected property emergency would delay our meeting. Then I called my assistant and asked her to reschedule the appointment for the afternoon. My voice remained calm even though my mind was racing. Experience had taught me that rushing through evidence usually created more problems than it solved. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, opened the recording software, and selected the previous evening beginning just before sunset. The playback timeline stretched across the bottom of the screen in a solid, uninterrupted line. Every camera had recorded normally throughout the entire night. No missing files, no interrupted connections, no power outages, no network failures. The system health report showed 100% recording integrity across every device. That was exactly what I expected because I maintained the equipment myself every month. Outside, the dirt still blocked my driveway, but inside this room, every second leading to that moment had already been preserved. Melissa Harper believed the darkness had hidden what happened overnight. She believed sleeping neighbors meant there would be no witnesses. She had overlooked one simple fact. Cameras do not get tired, they do not look away, and they never forget what they have already seen. Instead of opening the recordings immediately, I found myself thinking back over the previous several months, because none of what happened overnight had appeared out of nowhere. Melissa Harper had been building toward that morning one small step at a time. At first, the letters from the Homeowners Association seemed almost harmless. One notice claimed the edge of my driveway needed pressure washing because it no longer matched the neighborhood appearance standards. Another suggested that the decorative shrubs near my mailbox had grown beyond the recommended height by a few inches. A week later, I received another letter questioning whether the gravel border beside my driveway complied with the community landscaping guidelines. Every notice arrived neatly printed, politely worded, and supported by photographs taken from the street. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. I responded to every letter the same way. I documented the property, photographed the measurements, reviewed the governing documents, and submitted written replies before every deadline. My goal was never to argue. I simply believed that facts usually outlast opinions. Most of the time, the violations quietly disappeared without explanation, only to be replaced by another notice a few weeks later. Eventually, I attended a monthly homeowners association meeting because I wanted to understand why my property seemed to receive more attention than any other house on the block. Melissa chaired the meeting with the confidence of someone who rarely expected disagreement. About halfway through the agenda, she introduced what she described as an exciting neighborhood beautification initiative designed to improve curb appeal near the community entrance. Large presentation boards displayed artist renderings filled with flowering plants, decorative stone, and expanded landscape islands intended to create a more welcoming first impression for visitors. Many homeowners nodded with approval because the drawings looked attractive. Then I noticed something strange. One rendering showed a landscape bed extending much farther than the existing common area. I quietly compared the image with my own memory of the property layout. If the drawing reflected the actual construction plan, part of the new landscape would extend directly across the entrance of my driveway. I raised my hand and asked a simple question. I wanted to know whether every affected homeowner had already signed written permission allowing work on private property. The room became noticeably quieter. Melissa smiled politely before explaining that final details were still being coordinated and that residents should trust the board to manage the project responsibly. Her answer never actually addressed my question. After the meeting ended, I walked outside and studied the landscaped entrance from the sidewalk. The existing common area already looked clean and well-maintained. Nothing suggested an urgent need for major construction. Over the following weeks, I began noticing survey flags appearing briefly near the edge of the neighborhood entrance before disappearing again the next day. Landscaping contractors visited several times, taking measurements without speaking to nearby homeowners. Whenever I approached, they simply explained they were gathering information for a future improvement project. Something about the entire process felt unusually quiet. There were no community votes, no engineering plans distributed to residents, and no detailed construction schedule posted by the association. Then another violation letter arrived claiming that my driveway border interrupted the visual consistency of the planned landscape improvements. Reading that sentence, I finally understood the real objective. They were not trying to improve the neighborhood around my property. They were trying to redesign the neighborhood by using part of my property, and when I refused to cooperate, someone decided that asking for permission had become less convenient than acting first and explaining later. With the timeline loaded, I dragged the playback bar backward until the screen showed the quiet neighborhood just before midnight. Porch lights glowed softly across the street, sprinklers finished their evening cycles, and the last dog walker disappeared around the corner. Nothing looked unusual. I increased the playback speed and watched the hours slip by in silence until the timestamp reached 2:47 a.m. A pair of bright headlights appeared at the entrance to the subdivision. Seconds later, the license plate recognition camera automatically highlighted the first truck as it rolled toward my house. Then another followed behind it. Both vehicles slowed almost to a stop before turning directly toward my driveway. I switched to the overhead camera mounted beneath the second-story roofline. From that angle, I could clearly see the first dump truck backing into position while a compact skid steer unloaded from a flatbed trailer parked along the curb. The operator climbed into the machine with practiced movements, and within moments the first load of soil poured onto the front edge of my driveway. Fresh earth tumbled across the concrete in a thick wave, followed by decorative stone and shredded cedar mulch. Even through the video, I could almost remember the smell that had greeted me outside only minutes earlier. The synchronized timestamps showed every movement down to the second. One truck emptied its load and pulled away. Another immediately replaced it. The skid steer spread the material with careful precision instead of dumping it randomly. This was not careless work. Someone had planned exactly how to create a barrier high enough and wide enough to prevent any vehicle from leaving my garage. As the pile grew larger, I noticed workers placing orange survey flags along the edges as though they were finishing a legitimate construction site instead of blocking private property in the middle of the night. No flashing warning signs appeared. No temporary traffic control was installed. No permit notices were posted anywhere within view of the cameras. The entire operation depended on speed and darkness. They expected to finish before the neighborhood woke up. I switched between camera angles, watching each perspective merge into one uninterrupted sequence. The front porch camera captured faces as workers walked past the house. The driveway camera recorded every bucket of soil being pushed into place. The street camera documented each truck entering and leaving the neighborhood. The system quietly assembled a complete timeline without missing a single minute. At 3:18 a.m., another vehicle entered the frame. It was not construction equipment. It was a dark sport utility vehicle that I recognized immediately. Melissa Harper stepped out wearing reflective work boots and a light jacket over her business clothes. She walked across the fresh dirt, pointed toward the remaining open section of concrete, and spoke with the equipment operator while gesturing toward my garage. The workers continued moving material exactly where she indicated. She never looked toward my house. She never looked up at the cameras mounted beneath the roofline. She behaved like someone completely certain that the only witnesses were standing beside her. Watching the footage unfold, I realized this was no misunderstanding or clerical mistake. This was a coordinated overnight operation carried out with confidence that daylight would reveal a finished project instead of the decisions that had created it. My attention shifted from the wide camera views to the synchronized event timeline because I wanted to know exactly how carefully this operation had been organized. The software allowed every recording to play side by side with the timestamps locked together, so no one could claim that one camera had started earlier or another had stopped late. Every second matched perfectly. I enlarged the street camera first. As each truck entered the neighborhood, the license plate recognition system automatically captured a clear image of the front plate, then confirmed the rear plate as the vehicle departed. The software tagged every arrival, every departure, and every stop along the route. I exported the vehicle log into a separate folder without making a single edit. Next, I opened the driveway camera in full screen. The overhead angle showed each load being placed with surprising precision. The skid steer operator measured the edge of the concrete visually before pushing the soil into a smooth wall that completely blocked access to the garage. This was never about improving landscaping. It was about making certain that I could not leave my own property without removing thousands of pounds of material first. I switched to the front porch camera and watched Melissa move through the work area again. The microphone captured ordinary conversation with remarkable clarity because the workers stood only a few yards from the front door. I could hear engines idling, hydraulic equipment moving, boots crunching across gravel, and people discussing where to place the remaining decorative stone. Every sound matched the video perfectly. Then I noticed something even more valuable. One worker stopped beside the edge of my driveway and looked toward my house before speaking. His voice was calm, almost hesitant. He pointed toward the concrete and appeared to question whether they had permission to continue. Melissa stepped closer, answered confidently, and motioned toward the remaining open section near the garage. I replayed the exchange several times, increasing the audio clarity with software that removed engine noise without changing the original recording. The conversation became unmistakably clear. The worker said, "This looks like private property. Are we supposed to be doing this?" Melissa answered without hesitation, "Keep going. The association is handling it." Nobody argued after that. The skid steer moved forward immediately, and another bucket of soil sealed the last open path across my driveway. I leaned back in my chair and allowed several seconds of silence to pass. That brief conversation changed everything. Until that moment, someone might have argued that the contractors misunderstood property boundaries or followed inaccurate instructions. Now the recording showed that the concern had been raised before the work was completed, and the decision to continue had been made anyway. I saved the original video clips into a protected evidence folder, generated digital checksum reports verifying that the files had not been altered, and copied everything to a second encrypted cloud account. I knew enough about documentation to understand that preserving evidence correctly mattered just as much as collecting it. Outside my garage, the pile of dirt still blocked my truck, but inside my office the truth had already been preserved from multiple angles, complete with synchronized video, clear audio, precise timestamps, identifiable license plates, and one short conversation that transformed an uncomfortable neighborhood dispute into something far more difficult to explain away. I knew I had enough evidence to prove what had happened, but proving that something happened and proving that it mattered legally were two very different things. I resisted every temptation to call Melissa immediately because experience had taught me that people often revealed more when they believed they still controlled the situation. Instead, I opened the county property records, reviewed my recorded survey, and confirmed once again that the entire concrete driveway sat well inside my property line. There was no shared easement where the dirt had been placed. No temporary construction agreement had ever been signed. No maintenance authorization existed in my records. I then searched the city's online permit database for any landscaping permits, right-of-way permits, or temporary traffic control approvals associated with my address or the entrance to the subdivision. Every search returned the same answer. Nothing had been issued. I saved copies of those search results alongside the video evidence before making a single phone call. My first call went to a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. After watching less than 5 minutes of the synchronized recordings through a secure file-sharing link, he became unusually quiet. He finally said, "Do not edit anything. Do not post this online. Preserve every original file exactly as it is." That was already my plan. He explained that the recordings appeared to document not only the work itself, but also the decision-making process behind it. The audio captured a worker recognizing that the area appeared to be private property. Melissa had been given an opportunity to stop the project before the final loads were placed across my driveway. Instead, she instructed everyone to continue. That distinction mattered because it showed the concern had been raised before the work was completed. My attorney recommended contacting the City Code Enforcement Office immediately and requesting an inspection while the site remained unchanged. Less than an hour later, I received confirmation that an inspector would visit that afternoon. I also contacted the construction company whose name appeared on one of the trucks. I did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I simply informed the office manager that I possessed synchronized video showing their equipment operating on private property and asked whether the company had been hired under a written authorization from the property owner. After a brief pause, she admitted she did not know and promised to review their paperwork. Her tone changed noticeably when I mentioned that every truck, every operator, and every conversation had been recorded with synchronized timestamps. She asked me not to send the recordings until she had spoken with her supervisor. By early afternoon, my quiet street had become unexpectedly busy. Curious neighbors slowed as they drove past the pile of dirt. Some looked confused. Others seemed uncomfortable. Melissa was nowhere to be seen. She had been confident while directing equipment in the darkness, but daylight had introduced something she could not manage as easily. Documentation. Every minute that passed strengthened my position because the physical evidence remained exactly where her instructions had left it, while the digital evidence sat safely stored in multiple locations beyond anyone's ability to erase. 4. The first time since stepping onto my porch that morning, I no longer felt trapped behind the wall of dirt. I realized that the barrier blocking my driveway had quietly become the strongest piece of physical evidence supporting everything the cameras had already preserved. The city code enforcement inspector arrived shortly after 2 o'clock that afternoon in a marked pickup truck carrying a tablet, a measuring wheel, and a thick folder of inspection forms. He introduced himself, listened carefully while I explained the sequence of events, and made it clear that he would reach his own conclusions based on the evidence rather than anyone's opinion. That was exactly what I wanted. I walked him to the edge of the driveway where the fresh dirt still formed an almost solid barrier across the entrance to my garage. He photographed the entire area from multiple angles before taking measurements from the curb to the property line shown on the recorded survey I had already printed for him. After documenting the physical conditions, I invited him into my office where the synchronized camera recordings were ready to review. I played the footage without commentary, allowing the timeline to speak for itself. The inspector watched the trucks enter the neighborhood, observed the equipment unload, followed the movement of every bucket of soil, and carefully listened to the recorded conversation between the worker and Melissa. He asked me to replay that portion twice, then requested copies of the original files rather than edited clips. Because I had preserved everything exactly as recorded, exporting the evidence took only a few minutes. Each file retained its original metadata, timestamps, and integrity reports. Before leaving my office, the inspector logged every file into his evidence inventory and confirmed that the recordings appeared complete and uninterrupted. He then stepped outside to compare the timestamps with the physical condition of the property one final time. While he continued his inspection, another vehicle slowly entered the neighborhood. The construction company's operations manager climbed out carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that looked very different from the confidence I had seen in the workers overnight. She apologized for the inconvenience without admitting fault and explained that her company had been told the homeowners association possessed the necessary authority to perform the landscaping work. I simply told her that I understood contractors relied on the information they received, which was precisely why accurate documentation mattered. She quietly asked whether she could view the recording where her employees questioned the work location. After watching the exchange, she lowered the clipboard and remained silent for several seconds. She finally admitted that company policy required crews to stop work whenever private property concerns were raised until written authorization could be verified. That policy had not been followed after Melissa instructed them to continue. Within an hour, the operations manager placed a phone call from the sidewalk and informed her dispatcher that all remaining work connected to the neighborhood entrance project was suspended pending legal review. News traveled quickly through the subdivision. Several board members arrived separately after hearing that city officials and the contractor were both reviewing the situation. They stood near the clubhouse, speaking quietly among themselves while occasionally looking toward the blocked driveway. Their expressions suggested that many of them were seeing the project for the first time exactly as it actually existed instead of through the polished presentation shown during the association meeting. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the neighborhood, one thing became unmistakably clear. The discussion had already moved beyond landscaping preferences or neighborhood appearance. It had become a matter of documented decisions, verified evidence, and official records that no amount of confident explanations could easily erase. The following morning, the neighborhood felt unusually quiet, as though everyone understood that something important had shifted overnight. The pile of soil still blocked my driveway, but now bright inspection markings surrounded it, and temporary notices had been placed near the curb, documenting the city's review. Before 8 o'clock, my attorney called to tell me that the contractor's legal department had already reached out requesting copies of the evidence package through the proper channels. That alone told me the recordings had accomplished exactly what they were supposed to do. Facts were replacing assumptions. A few hours later, I received another call, this time from the construction company's operations manager. Her voice carried none of the confidence I had heard the previous afternoon. She explained that after reviewing the synchronized recordings, employee statements, dispatch logs, and the work authorization documents, the company had determined that its crews had relied on instructions that exceeded the authority described in the project paperwork. Effective immediately, every activity associated with the entrance landscaping project had been suspended. She also informed me that the company's insurance carrier had opened a claim to evaluate the property damage and coordinate with the homeowners association regarding responsibility. Shortly afterwards, several members of the association's board requested an emergency meeting. Unlike previous meetings filled with presentation boards and polished speeches, this gathering had a completely different atmosphere. Residents filled nearly every seat. Some had printed copies of association bylaws. Others quietly discussed the inspection taking place outside. Melissa Harper entered carrying a binder, but avoided making eye contact with anyone. One board member began asking simple questions that quickly became increasingly specific. When had the project actually been approved? Where was the written authorization from affected property owners? Who verified the property boundaries before construction began? Which permits had been obtained before heavy equipment entered private property? Each question was followed by longer periods of silence. Melissa attempted to explain that the project had been intended to improve the appearance of the neighborhood, but the discussion had already moved beyond intentions. Several board members had now reviewed portions of the synchronized recordings provided. Through the proper legal process, they understood that the issue was no longer whether landscaping looked attractive. The issue was whether decisions had been made without proper authority after concerns had already been raised. One resident stood and calmly reminded everyone that trust was far more difficult to restore than flower beds or decorative stone. No one argued with him. By late afternoon, I watched through my front window as representatives from the contractor, the insurance company, and the homeowners association met near the blocked driveway with measuring equipment and clipboards. They spent nearly an hour documenting the existing conditions before agreeing that nothing would be disturbed until restoration plans had been finalized. My attorney later confirmed that preserving the site until all parties completed their inspections protected everyone involved and prevented future disputes about what had actually occurred. As the sun began to set, Melissa walked alone across the parking lot toward her vehicle without stopping to speak to anyone. The confidence she displayed only 2 mornings earlier had quietly disappeared, replaced by the realization that every important decision had been preserved by objective evidence instead of fading into conflicting memories. The cameras had never argued with anyone. They had simply recorded the truth, and now that truth was steadily dismantling every assumption that had allowed the project to move forward in the first place. 3 weeks later, I backed my pickup truck out of my garage for the first time since that unbelievable morning, and the concrete beneath my tires looked exactly as it had before anyone decided my property could become part of someone else's project. The restoration had been completed under written agreements reviewed by attorneys, documented by inspectors, and verified before the final equipment left my driveway. Every load of dirt had been removed. Every decorative stone had been taken away. The concrete had been professionally cleaned and inspected to confirm that no permanent damage remained. The homeowners association paid for the restoration, my legal expenses were resolved through the settlement process, and the contractor completed the corrective work under the supervision of the city to ensure everything matched the original condition of the property. During that same period, the association held another meeting, but this one was remarkably different from every gathering that came before it. The discussion focused on governance, documentation, and accountability instead of landscaping projects. Several residents proposed new procedures requiring written verification before any work affecting private property could even be considered. Others requested greater transparency, including easier access to meeting records and project approvals. Every proposal reflected the same lesson. Good intentions could never replace proper authority. Before the meeting ended, Melissa Harper quietly announced her resignation as president of the Homeowners Association. She offered no dramatic speech and no lengthy defense of her decisions. She simply stated that she believed stepping aside was in the community's best interest. No one applauded. No one celebrated. The room remained calm because everyone understood that the outcome had not been determined by personalities or louder arguments. It had been determined by evidence that spoke with complete consistency from beginning to end. A few days later, I received the final inspection report confirming that the restoration work satisfied every requirement. I filed the document alongside the recordings, property records, correspondence, and photographs that had accumulated throughout the entire process. Then I archived everything into a secure folder where I hoped it would never need to be opened again. On a quiet Saturday morning, I sat in my office with a cup of coffee and played the recordings one final time. I watched the peaceful neighborhood before midnight, the first truck entering the subdivision, the workers unloading soil, the conversation that changed everything, the inspection that followed, and finally the restoration that returned my driveway to exactly what it had always been. The cameras never exaggerated. They never guessed. They never chose sides. They simply preserved each moment until the truth could be examined carefully and fairly. Looking back, I realized that the wall of dirt blocking my driveway had never been the greatest obstacle I faced. The real challenge was making certain that facts remained stronger than assumptions. Fortunately, facts have remarkable patience. They wait quietly inside photographs, documents, timestamps, and recordings until someone is willing to look honestly at what they reveal. That experience changed the way many people in our neighborhood viewed technology. Cameras were no longer seen as symbols of distrust. They became reminders that accountability protects everyone when used responsibly. I never installed my security system because I expected to challenge my own homeowners association. I installed it because I believed preparation was wiser than regret. In the end, the most valuable feature was not the cameras themselves, or the cloud storage, or the synchronized timestamps. It was the simple certainty that when the truth was finally needed, it was already waiting, exactly as it happened, untouched by memory, untouched by opinion, and strong enough to let justice arrive without ever raising its voice.